The year is 1552. On the hills above the Volga River, 150,000 Russian soldiers surround the last unconquered fortress of the Mongol Empire. And inside its walls, 40,000 men, women, and children are about to be erased from the earth. The air carries the first edge of autumn cold. The landscape is consumed. Tents stretch to the horizon in every direction. Banners snap in the wind. The double-headed eagle of Moscow, repeated 10,000 times across the hills. Siege guns sit in earthen emplacements, their bronze mouths aimed at timber walls that have stood for centuries. And drifting through the camp, mixing with wood smoke and the acrid bite of black powder, is something harder to name. Something that has been building for 300 years. It is rage. Concentrated. Patient. Finally given a target. At the center of this army, seated beneath a silk pavilion, surrounded by priests, bodyguards, and the holiest icon in all of Russia, sits a young man barely 22 years old. His name is Ivan Vasilyevich. Ivan IV. The one the Russians call Grozny. The Terrible. He does not look like a man who has come to talk. He looks like a man who has come to finish something. 150 cannons are aimed at those walls. Mines packed with gunpowder are being burrowed beneath the city's foundations. European engineers, men who learned their craft in the wars of religion tearing through Germany and Italy, are calculating blast radiuses and powder charges with the calm of butchers measuring cuts. This is not a raid. This is not a punitive expedition. This is total war. The kind that does not stop until nothing is left standing. And inside those walls, behind massive timber palisades reinforced with packed earth, behind 13 watchtowers and a deep moat carved into the landward approach, 40,000 souls stare out at the encirclement and understand one truth. No relief column is marching. No allied army is riding to their rescue. Crimea is too far. Astrakhan is too weak. The Nogai horde is fractured and leaderless. Kazan stands alone. The question hanging over this fortress, the question that has been building since the first Mongol horsemen crossed into Russian lands 4 centuries ago, is about to be answered in fire, in blood, and in the roar of 150 cannons firing together. But here is the part that most histories gloss over. This siege is not just about territory. It is not about trade routes or military advantage alone. It is about something older. Something that has been rotting inside the Russian soul for 300 years. And if you do not understand that wound, nothing that happens on these walls will make sense. If you have ever looked at St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow's Red Square, those wild, colorful onion domes that seem almost joyful, and wondered why it was built, the answer is written in blood. Each dome is said to represent a conquered fortress, and the blood behind those domes flows from the streets we are about to walk through. Stay with this one. Drop a like if you are ready. Tell us where you are watching from. Because before the cannons fire, before the walls fall, before the earth itself splits open beneath a city that has stood for centuries, you need to understand what Kazan did to Russia. And that story begins in 1237. The Mongol hordes of Yadegar Khan pour across the Russian principalities with the indifference of a flood-consuming low ground. They come from the east. They come in numbers no Russian army can match. And they come without mercy. Ryazan falls first. The city does not just surrender. It ceases to exist. Men are cut down in the streets. Women and children are herded into churches and the churches are set ablaze. The smoke rises for days. Then Vladimir burns. The same way. Fire. Steel. Silence. Then Kiev. Kiev, the golden mother of all Russian cities. The cradle of Orthodox Christianity on Russian soil. The city that was supposed to be eternal. The Mongols reduce it to a field of shattered churches and bones. A traveler passing through 6 years later writes that he can still see skulls and human remains scattered across the open ground. Countless dead. No one left to bury them. The princes who survive do so by bowing. They ride east to Sarai, the Mongol capital on the lower Volga, and they press their foreheads into the dirt before foreign khans. They beg for patents of rule. Permission to govern their own people. Permission that can be revoked at any moment, for any reason, on any whim. And the tribute flows eastward. Silver, furs, grain, human beings. Russian captives fill Tatar slave markets year after year, decade after decade. Sons are separated from mothers. Daughters disappear into the steppe. The trade is enormous. It is constant. It does not stop. 300 years. Think about that for a moment. Your great-grandparents lived under foreign masters. Your grandparents lived under foreign masters. Your parents. Your children. That is what Mongol rule means to the Russian principalities. Not one bad century. 3 of them, stacked on top of each other, with no end visible. But here is the thing about empires that most people miss. They do not die from outside pressure alone. They crack from within. By the 1440s, the Golden Horde, that vast dominion stretching from the Danube to the Irtysh, fractures along its own fault lines. Successor khanates rise from the wreckage. Crimea in the south, eventually backed by Ottoman power. Astrakhan at the mouth of the Volga, controlling the Caspian trade. Sibir beyond the Urals, vast and remote. And Kazan. Kazan sits on the middle Volga. It controls the river trade routes connecting the northern forests to the Caspian Sea and the markets of Persia beyond. Its bazaars overflow with Siberian furs and Persian silks and black earth grain. Its rulers carry the blood of Genghis Khan in their veins. Its warriors are horsemen who can loose arrows at full gallop and vanish into the grasslands before any counterattack can form. And it is close. Dangerously close to Moscow. Close enough to launch raids whenever it pleases. Close enough to carry off captives by the hundreds. Close enough to burn crops and torch villages and remind every living Russian that the Mongol age is not finished. That the old masters still ride. That the old humiliation still draws blood. But Kazan is more than a military threat. It is the symbol. The living proof. Every village burned by Tatar raiders, that is Kazan. Every family that lost children to the slave markets, that is Kazan. Every prince who had to ride east and press his face into foreign dirt to keep his throne, that is Kazan. The fortress on the hill above the Kazanka River is not just a city. It is 3 centuries of suffering given a set of walls and a location on a map. The wound that will not close. Because the blade is still inside. And the man who is going to rip it out. The man sitting under that silk pavilion with 150,000 soldiers at his back and the holiest icon in Russia on his wagon, was forged in a darkness that makes 3 centuries of Mongol rule look almost simple. Because before Ivan the Terrible conquered Kazan, he had to survive something far more intimate. His own childhood. Ivan Vasilyevich is 3 years old when he becomes Grand Prince of Moscow. His father is already dead. His mother will follow soon, poisoned, most historians believe, by the very men who are supposed to protect her son. And what follows is not a childhood. It is a lesson in what human beings do when power is within reach and no one is strong enough to stop them. The boyar families descend on the regency like predators on a carcass. The Shuiskys, the Belskys, the Glinskys, they do not care about the boy. They care about the authority his name represents. They fight each other in the corridors of the Kremlin. They murder each other's allies in rooms adjacent to where the child sleeps. They feast in his halls while he goes hungry. They drag him out in fine robes when foreign ambassadors visit, then abandon him for months once the performance is over. The boy watches, and the boy learns. He learns that loyalty is a word men use when they want something from you. He learns that promises survive exactly as long as the power behind them. He learns that the people who show mercy are the people who end up dead in hallways with no witnesses. And he learns, in the deepest, most unreachable part of himself, in the place where a child's ability to trust is supposed to live, that power is the only wall between a man and the grave. No priest softens these lessons. No tutor corrects them. Because every day the boy spends in that court confirms them again. By the time Ivan is 17, he is done being a prop. In 1547, he does something no Russian ruler has ever attempted. He does not crown himself Grand Prince. That diminished, dependent title that still carries the stench of Mongol approval, of princes begging permission to rule their own lands. He crowns himself Tsar. Tsar. The Russian form of Caesar. The title of emperors. The word lands like a war hammer in every direction at once. To the boyars, your era of regency, of manipulation, of treating the throne as a toy, that era is finished. The crown belongs to one man now. And that man does not forget what you did to him when he was small. To the Catholic kingdoms of the West, Moscow stands equal to any throne in Christendom. Rome may have its pope. The Habsburgs may have their emperor. But Russia has its Tsar. And the Tsar bows to no one. To the Orthodox faithful, this is confirmation of everything the monks and metropolitans have been whispering for decades. Moscow is the third Rome, the heir to Byzantium, the last fortress of true Christianity on earth. Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. Rome fell to heresy. Moscow remains, and its Tsar is God's anointed sword. And to the east, to the Khanates still clinging to the fading ghost of Mongol greatness, the message is the simplest of all. The age of Russian submission is over, and the new Tsar intends to prove it with blood. His gaze turns toward Kazan almost immediately. The reasons stack on top of each other, strategic, personal, spiritual, civilizational, until the weight of them becomes irresistible. Strategic, Kazan controls the Volga. The Volga is the spine of Eurasian trade. Whoever holds that river holds the key to commerce stretching from the Baltic to Persia and beyond. As long as a Tatar Khanate sits on the middle Volga, Russia's trade is hostage to a foreign power. Personal, Ivan is a young ruler with everything to prove. An orphan who clawed his way out of a court of wolves. He needs the world, and his own boyars, to see that Moscow has a master now. A master who does not flinch. Spiritual, Kazan is Muslim. Ivan is the self-declared champion of Orthodox Christianity. Metropolitan Macarius, the head of the Russian Church, the man who placed the crown on Ivan's head, speaks of Kazan the way popes once spoke of Jerusalem, a holy city in the wrong hands, a crusade waiting to happen. Civilizational, Kazan is the last living proof that the heirs of Genghis Khan still hold power over Russian destiny. As long as it stands, the Mongol age is not truly finished. Ivan does not want to manage Kazan. He does not want to contain it. He wants to destroy the idea that the steppe still commands the forest. All four causes converge on one city, one fortress, one set of walls. But Ivan does not march immediately. Moscow has tried to manage Kazan through softer means before. Through diplomacy, through the careful installation of puppet rulers, through decades of meddling in the Khanate's internal politics. The current occupant of Kazan's throne, Khan Yadegar Mokhammad, sits there because Moscow approved him. A young man, supposedly pliable, expected to keep the Khanate quiet. Yadegar proves less controllable than expected. He reaches out to Crimea. He permits raids against Russian borderlands. He begins behaving not like a puppet but like a sovereign, like a man who believes his own authority. And Ivan, whose patience was burned out of him in those boyar corridors before he was old enough to hold a sword, watches this defiance and makes a decision that will reshape the map of Eurasia. No more puppet khans. No more managed compliance. No more Kazan. At all. In the spring of 1552, the largest army Russia has ever assembled begins to gather. 150,000 men drawn from every corner of Ivan's domain. The composition tells you everything about what this campaign is. Boyar cavalry in heavy armor. Lances couched. Sabers polished to a killing edge. These are the old warrior aristocracy of Russia, men whose families have fought Tatars for generations. They ride with grudges older than their grandfathers. Streltsy musketeers. Russia's new professional infantry. Armed with arquebus and the short-handled axes that serve as both camp tool and close-quarters weapon. Drilled. Disciplined. Capable of delivering massed volley fire that no cavalry charge can survive. Cossack light horsemen from the southern steppe. Irregular. Ferocious. Men who live in the saddle and fight like they have already lost everything worth protecting. Tatar auxiliaries who have turned against their own people. Who ride now under the double-headed eagle against their own kinsmen. For survival, for ambition, or for the cold recognition that Moscow's power is rising and Kazan's is falling. And the Europeans. German and Italian military engineers recruited from the bloodiest battlefields of the Reformation. These men have spent decades perfecting the science of cracking fortifications. They bring 150 cannons, massive bombards that hurl stone balls weighing 300 pounds alongside lighter field pieces for repositioning, gunpowder by the ton, cannonballs, chain shot, incendiary shells designed to arc over walls and burst into fire among wooden buildings, And they bring one more thing. The knowledge of how to dig mines. How to burrow beneath fortress foundations, pack the tunnels with black powder, and bring down in a single detonation what centuries of construction built. This is the killing science of a continent imported to the Russian steppe. And it is about to be unleashed on a city that has never faced anything like it. Traveling at the heart of this army, carried on a cart draped in cloth of gold, is the miracle-working icon of Our Lady of Vladimir, the holiest relic in Russia, blessed by Metropolitan Macarius himself, who has declared this campaign a holy crusade, God's own work, heaven's mandate. Ivan sends his ultimatum to Kazan. The language leaves no space for negotiation. Surrender. Convert to orthodoxy. Submit to Moscow, absolutely, permanently, forever, or be destroyed. Khan Yadegar receives the terms. He is young. He is outmatched. He is defending walls that have never been breached. And he understands, with a clarity that strips away every comfortable illusion, that surrender on these terms is not survival. It is the slow death of his people, their faith, their identity. Everything. A warrior's end is at least an ending with dignity. He refuses. And with that refusal, the machinery of total war begins to move. 150,000 men start marching east. The ground trembles under their boots and hooves and iron-wheeled gun carriages. Dust rises in columns visible for miles. But what Yadegar does not know, what no one behind those ancient walls can possibly suspect, is that the deadliest weapon in Ivan's arsenal is not the 150 cannons being dragged toward his city. It is not the musketeers or the Cossack riders or the armored cavalry. It is a quiet Saxon engineer the Russians call Razmisl, a man who thinks in fuse lengths and powder charges. A man who is, at this very moment, studying the underground water channels that keep 40,000 people alive inside those walls. And what Razmisl is planning will not just breach Kazan's defenses. It will rip the earth itself out from beneath them. The Russian host reaches the outskirts of Kazan in August, and what follows is not an attack. It is a strangulation. The siege lines go up first. Trenches. Palisades. Earthen walls thrown up in a vast ring around the city, cutting it off from the outside world with the precision of a garrote pulled tight. Teams of soldiers dig through the night, filling baskets with earth, stacking timber, driving stakes into the ground by torchlight while arrows hiss down from the walls above. Artillery emplacements take shape at calculated intervals. Raised earthen platforms designed to bear the massive weight of the heavy guns without sinking into the soft ground along the river. Approach trenches begin their slow crawl forward. They do not run straight. They zigzag, angling left, then right, then left again, so that defenders on the walls cannot fire down the length of them. Every yard of these trenches costs sweat and blood. Sappers dig with shovels and bare hands while archers on the ramparts pick off anyone who raises his head above the lip. Russian boats seize control of the Volga. River patrols cut the last threads of supply. The last hope of escape by water. Kazan is sealed. Nothing enters. Nothing leaves. Inside the fortress, 40,000 people watch the ring close around them. Warriors, merchants, families, children who do not understand why the sky keeps getting darker with smoke. The walls are strong, massive timber palisades packed with earth, 13 towers, multiple gates, a moat on the landward side deep enough to drown a horse. These walls have held before, against previous Russian expeditions, against rival Tatar factions, against everything the steppe has thrown at them for generations. But what sits on those hills now is not a steppe army. It is something Kazan has never faced. And the men behind those walls know it. They do not wait passively. Tatar cavalry bursts from the gates at dawn. Horsemen thunder across the open ground, hitting Russian positions in lightning strikes. Killing sentries, overturning earth baskets, torching half-finished trenches, then wheeling back behind the walls before the Russian infantry can respond. At dusk the same. Archers station themselves at key points on the ramparts and pick off gun crews and engineers with a patience that borders on artistry. Sorties target the siege works directly. Burning approach trenches. Spiking cannons by hammering iron nails into their touch holes. Killing sappers in their own ditches. Khan Yadegar moves among his warriors. He is visible. He is steady. He speaks of God's protection. Of the ancestors who built these walls. Of the oath every man swore to defend them. His presence holds the garrison together. But the mathematics are merciless. 150,000 against 40,000. Every trench the Tatars burn, 2 more replace it by morning. Every gun spiked, another is hauled forward from the Russian reserves. The sorties inflict casualties. Real ones, but the Russian army absorbs them the way the Volga absorbs stones thrown into its current. Without slowing. And no one is coming. Crimea, the only khanate powerful enough to threaten Moscow, is 1,000 miles away and tangled in its own wars with the Ottomans and Poland. Astrakhan is too weak to march. The Nogai horde is divided among chiefs who cannot agree on their own survival, let alone someone else's. Every messenger Yadegar sends out rides into silence. No answer comes back. No hoofbeats on the horizon. No allied banners rising in the distance. Kazan stands alone against the largest army Russia has ever assembled. On August 23, Ivan gives the order, and the world changes. 150 cannons fire together. The sound is not thunder. Thunder is natural. This is something else. This is the sound of the earth being struck by something it was not built to endure. A rolling, continuous roar that shakes the ground beneath the feet of every man on both sides of the walls. Stone balls weighing 300 pounds smash into the timber palisades, splintering oak beams as thick as a man's torso. Lighter guns fire grapeshot at the ramparts, iron fragments that scream through the air and turn flesh into something unrecognizable. Incendiary shells arc over the walls. They trail smoke like comets. They land among the tightly packed wooden houses inside the fortress. And they burst. Fire takes hold immediately. Homes, market stalls, storehouses. The flames jump from roof to roof with a speed that defies any bucket line. Families pour into the streets, searching for shelter that does not exist. The smoke rises in columns that can be seen from miles away. And the bombardment does not stop. Ivan's engineers have organized the guns into rotating batteries. When one crew exhausts itself, arms shaking, ears bleeding, faces blackened with powder residue, another crew takes its place. The guns cool for minutes, then roar again. Day bleeds into night. Night bleeds into dawn. The thunder never ceases. It becomes a physical presence. A pressure on the chest. A vibration in the bones. Defenders who try to sleep are jolted awake by impacts that crack the walls of their cellars. The wounded scream beneath collapsed timber. The sound layered on sound until no one inside those walls can remember what silence was. Sections of the wall begin to sag. Timber buckles. Earth crumbles. Gaps appear. But the Tatars do not break. They patch breaches as fast as the Russian guns make them. Timber is dragged from demolished buildings and hammered into the gaps. Earth is shoveled against the weakened sections. Behind the most damaged stretches of wall, secondary palisades go up, inner barriers that will force attackers to fight through 2 defenses instead of 1. The best archers are stationed at the breaches. They make the Russians pay for every yard of approach, every hour of digging. Kazan bends under the bombardment, bends until it seems it must snap, but it holds. And so the war moves underground. Rosmisl, the Saxon engineer, has been waiting for this moment. He does not think in cavalry charges or wall assaults. He thinks in soil density, in powder ratios, in the precise amount of force required to collapse a structure from beneath. He has identified 3 targets. The Atalik Tower on the northwest corner, one of Kazan's strongest defensive positions. The Arsk Gate on the eastern approach, the main entrance to the fortress, and the most critical target of all, the water supply. Kazan draws its fresh water from underground springs. Channels and tunnels beneath the fortress connect these springs to the city above. 40,000 people depend on them. Without them, the wells inside the walls, shallow, never intended for this many mouths, will run dry in days. Rosmisl begins digging. Teams of sappers work in shifts around the clock. They burrow forward through the earth in tunnels barely wide enough for a man to crawl. The soil shifts unpredictably. Rock-hard clay 1 yard, waterlogged sand the next. Supports must be placed constantly. Timbers braced against collapse. The air is close, hot, thick with the smell of damp earth and the sweat of men working in spaces no human body was meant to occupy. Tunnels collapse without warning. Earth gives way and swallows men whole. They die in the dark, buried alive, their screams muffled by the soil pressing against their mouths. And then the Tatars hear the digging, the scraping, the tapping, coming from beneath their feet. They dig counter mines, shafts driven downward to intercept the Russian tunnels, to break into them, to stop them by any means available. What follows is combat that no battlefield manual describes. Hand-to-hand fighting in passages so narrow a man cannot swing a sword. Lit by torches that gutter in the bad air. Choked with dust so thick it fills the lungs like liquid. Men stab with knives, bludgeon with clubs, claw at each other with bare hands in a darkness so complete that the only way to know whether you have killed your enemy is to feel him stop moving beneath you. Russians flood Tatar counter-mines with diverted water. Tatars light fires at tunnel mouths, trying to fill the Russian shafts with choking smoke. Men die underground, unseen, unrecorded, their names lost to history forever, while the great guns continue to roar above them, indifferent to the war being fought beneath their foundations. By early September, Rosmisel's primary mine is complete. It runs beneath the underground springs that feed Kazan's water supply. Barrels of gunpowder are rolled into the chamber, packed tight. Fuses laid with hands that do not tremble. Ivan gives the order. The detonation splits the earth. A geyser of dirt and stone and shattered timber erupts north of the city wall. The ground heaves upward. A crater 30 feet deep opens where solid earth stood moments before. The underground springs. The channels, the tunnels, the ancient water system that has sustained this fortress for generations, are obliterated in a single heartbeat. Inside Kazan, the effect is immediate. The water is gone. The wells that remain inside the fortress are shallow. They were never designed to support 40,000 people. Rationing begins within hours. But every commander, every imam, every mother measuring a half cup for a child burning with fever understands the calculation. Time has switched sides. While the city begins to die of thirst, Rosmisel's sappers are finishing 2 more mines. One beneath the Adalik Tower. One beneath the Arsk Gate. Both packed with enough gunpowder to unmake the earth itself. And above the siege lines a shape is rising. A mobile siege tower. Taller than Kazan's walls. Armored with animal hides soaked in water to resist fire arrows. Fitted with drawbridges that can slam down onto the ramparts and pour soldiers directly into the defense. The Tatars watch it grow, day by day, beam by beam, and they understand exactly what it means. They stockpile stones, boiling water, anything that can be thrown down on men crossing a bridge. They reinforce the section of wall the tower will approach. They tighten their grip on sabers worn thin from weeks of fighting. And they pray in mosques that shudder with every cannon impact. Ivan sets the date. October 2nd, 1552. 3 simultaneous attacks. The mines. The tower. A general assault from every direction at once. Time to hit the defenders before they can recover from any single blow. If you are still here, if you can feel the ground tightening beneath the city, if you can sense what is about to happen on that cold October morning, hit subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because what happens next unfolds in a single day. And when it is over, the map of Eurasia will never look the same again. Dawn breaks cold and gray over the Volga. A thin mist drifts through the Russian siege lines, clinging to the earth, threading between the tents and gun emplacements and the legs of horses stamping nervously in the half-light. 150,000 men stir. They eat cold rations. They check weapons. They murmur prayers to saints whose names they can barely remember through the fog of exhaustion. Assault columns begin to form in the trenches, long lines of men with axes and sabers and arquebus, pressing shoulder to shoulder in the narrow earthen corridors, breathing one another's fear. Everyone knows what is coming. The order has circulated through the ranks in whispers and hand signals. Today is the day. Today the walls come down. Today Kazan falls, or every man in these trenches dies trying to make it so. On the hills behind the lines, Ivan IV sits his horse in full armor. The crown of Monomac gleams on his head, gold and sable and the weight of every Russian ruler who has worn it before him. His bodyguard surrounds him in a ring of steel. Priests stand nearby with icons raised, their chanting barely audible above the low roar of 150,000 men preparing to kill. The Tsar's face shows nothing. His hand rests on his thigh. His eyes are fixed on the walls. Inside Kazan, Khan Yadegar moves through his dying city for the last time. He walks the streets that are no longer streets, rubble corridors between collapsed buildings choked with broken timber and the smell of decay. He speaks to his commanders, to the imams, to the common warriors stationed on what remains of the walls. He tells them what a leader must tell men on the last morning of the world. That if they hold today, the Russians may withdraw before winter. That God protects the faithful. That these walls have never been taken. He does not tell them that the wells are nearly dry. That disease is spreading through every quarter. That the dead are stacking up faster than the living can bury them. That thousands have already fallen to the bombardment alone, and more are falling every hour. He tells them to hold. He tells them to fight. He prays with them one final time. And then the earth opens. 10 o'clock in the morning. The mine beneath the Yadegar Tower detonates. The explosion is beyond anything human experience can prepare a man to witness. The ground heaves upward, not cracking, not splitting, but lifting, as though the earth itself is rejecting what stands upon it. The Yadegar Tower, stone and timber and the warriors who manned it, disintegrates. Not falls. Not collapses. Ceases to exist. Along with 30 yards of wall on either side. A column of dirt and smoke and fire climbs into the sky, mushrooming outward, visible from every hill for miles. The blast wave rolls through the fortress, flattening wooden structures, hurling men off their feet, killing hundreds who were standing nowhere near the walls. The sound arrives a heartbeat later. A concussion so deep it is felt in the chest before it reaches the ears. Men on both sides of the siege lines are struck deaf. They stand in a world that has gone suddenly, horribly silent, except for a ringing that will live inside their skulls for the rest of their lives. Before a single defender can recover, before the dust even begins to settle, the second mine detonates beneath the Arsk gate. Another tower vanishes. Another section of wall collapses inward, sliding down into a rubble slope of shattered timber and crushed earth. The smoke from two detonations merges into a single dark cloud that rolls across the fortress, blinding everyone inside. 2 explosions. 2 breaches. 30 seconds apart. And now the siege tower begins to move. Pulled by teams of oxen and pushed by hundreds of soldiers, the massive wooden structure creaks forward across the churned earth toward the western wall. Its armored flanks bristle with Russian troops clinging to its platforms, weapons drawn, faces tight with the knowledge that the drawbridge above them will drop in minutes and they will be the first to cross. Behind the tower, the assault columns surge forward from the trenches. Streltsy musketeers in disciplined ranks. Boyar cavalry fighting on foot, helmets strapped, axes gripped in gauntlet hands. Cossacks in loose formations screaming. Priests holding icons overhead, chanting prayers that are swallowed by the roar of men running toward death. On the hill, Ivan watches. His hand rises, holds, drops. The assault begins from every direction at once. The first Russian soldiers to reach the crater where the Yadegar Tower stood expect to find open ground. They find something else entirely. The Tatars have recovered from the blast with a speed that defies comprehension. Warriors pour into the gap, bleeding, deafened, covered in dust, and form a human wall of steel in desperation. They do not have fortifications anymore. They have their bodies, and they use them. Archers on the intact sections of rampart fire down into the Russian columns. Every arrow finds flesh at this range. The fight becomes a melee at the crater's edge. Men slip on loose earth soaked with blood. They stab upward. They hack downward. They fall and are trampled by the men behind them. Bodies pile up at the breach, Russian and Tatar tangled together in death, and the living climb over the dead to keep fighting. For 30 minutes, the breach holds. Russian officers scream orders that no one can hear above the roar of combat. The advance stalls. The columns compress. Men at the front cannot move forward. Men at the back cannot see why. The chaos is total. Then the Streltsy reach the breach in force. Rank after rank of musketeers. They do not charge. They form firing lines. At close range, murderously close, close enough to see the expressions on the faces of the men they are about to kill, they level their arquebus and fire. The synchronized crash of hundreds of guns discharging together is a sound this land has never heard before. Smoke erupts in a white wall. Lead balls tear through the Tatar defenders at a range where armor is meaningless and flesh offers no resistance. When the smoke clears, pushed aside by the next volley already being loaded, gaps have opened in the Tatar line. The human wall has holes in it now. Holes that widen with every volley. The defenders are falling back. The Russians pour through the breach. At the western wall, the siege tower reaches its target. The drawbridge hangs for one final moment, a wooden jaw suspended above the rampart, and then drops with a crash that cracks the timber beneath it. Russian soldiers charge across. They meet Tatar defenders on the narrow walkway in hand-to-hand combat so compressed that men cannot swing their weapons fully. They shove. They stab. They push each other off the walls, bodies tumbling 30 feet to the streets below, to the ditch beyond, and for terrible minutes the fighting sways back and forth with neither side yielding. A Tatar commander, a man whose name no chronicle records, whose face no artist preserved, rallies his warriors and leads a counterattack that drives the first wave of Russians back onto the tower itself. For one suspended moment it works. The Russian advance halts. The bridge is contested. The wall holds. But the moment does not last. More Russians cross the drawbridge. More scale ladders thrown up along the wall on either side. The Tatars cannot be everywhere at once. Gaps open. Russian banners appear on the ramparts, planted by soldiers who die seconds later but who have marked the high water point of the advance for the men behind them. The banners stay up. The bodies fall. The advance continues. At the Arsk gate, the battering ram has been pounding the barricade of timber and overturned carts for 20 minutes. Boiling water cascades down from above. Arrows. Musket balls. The crews operating the ram die and are replaced. Die and are replaced. Die and are replaced. The ram keeps swinging. The barricade splinters. Cracks. Holds for one more impact. Then collapses inward. Russian troops flood through the shattered gate. They fan out into the streets. And the battle changes. This is no longer a siege. This is something else. This is house-to-house killing in alleys so narrow that two men can barely fight side by side. The formations dissolve. The discipline dissolves. Everything dissolves into isolated groups of men stabbing and hacking through smoke and rubble. And then the fires come. Whether set deliberately by defenders trying to create impassable barriers or sparked by overturned lamps and scattered coals from cooking fires, no one will ever know with certainty. The flames take hold with a ferocity that seems almost sentient. They race through the tightly packed wooden buildings. Within an hour, entire districts are consumed. The smoke drops visibility to arm's length. Soldiers on both sides fight blind, swinging at shapes that materialize from the murk, unable to tell friend from enemy until steel meets flesh. The roar of the flames drowns out the screams. The heat warps the air. Kazan is not burning. Kazan is becoming fire itself. Khan Yadegar rallies what remains of his garrison near the central mosque. Around him gather the men who have fought on every section of wall, who have lost brothers in the bombardment, sons in the breaches, fathers in the underground tunnels. They have nothing left. No water, no walls, no hope of relief. What they have is the determination to make the end cost something. They barricade the streets around the mosque. They form shield walls. They grip weapons worn thin by weeks of constant use. And they wait. The Russian tide comes from three directions at once. Through the Atalik breach. Over the western wall. Through the shattered Arsk gate. Streltsy advancing in firing lines, clearing buildings with volleys and axes. Boyar warriors hacking through barricades. Cossacks rampaging through the alleys with a fury that has no off switch. The last defense crumbles. Not all at once. Piece by piece. A barricade falls here. A shield wall breaks there. The perimeter shrinks, tightens, shrinks again. By mid-afternoon, organized resistance inside Kazan has ceased to exist. Khan Yadegar, the young ruler who refused Ivan's ultimatum, who chose defiance over the slow death of submission, looks at the burning city around him and makes his final choice. Not a warrior's death. A surrender. Not because he believes terms will be offered, but because every man who dies in a suicidal last stand is a man who cannot protect the women and children still hiding in the cellars. He is brought to the Russian lines under a white banner. There are no terms. Ivan orders the killing to continue. Russian soldiers move through the burning streets with methodical thoroughness. The line between combatant and non-combatant disappears in the smoke. Some Tatars are pulled aside and shackled, The young, the strong, those worth something in labor. Others are dragged to the ramparts they defended and thrown from the walls. Others simply die where they are found. The massacre runs through the afternoon, through the evening, through the long hours of a darkness lit only by the fires consuming what remains of the city. It continues until the Russian priests, the same men who blessed this campaign as God's holy work, who carried icons at the head of the assault columns, who chanted prayers as the mines detonated, approach Ivan and beg him to call a halt. The Tsar relents. By the time silence falls over Kazan, true silence, the first in weeks, a silence made heavier by everything that filled the air before it, the last independent Tatar Khanate of the Volga has ceased to exist. The fortress that dominated Russian nightmares for 300 years is a smoking ruin. The walls are rubble. The towers are craters. The streets are choked with bodies, Tatar and Russian tangled together, frozen in the positions where death found them. The Mongol age is over. But what rises from these ashes, the empire that is about to be born in this rubble, the legacy that will carry forward for centuries, the cost that Ivan himself will pay for the lessons he has learned on this ground, that story is only beginning. On the morning of October 3, 1552, Ivan IV enters Kazan on foot. He walks through the shattered gates in full regalia, the robes of state, the crown, the cross at his chest catching the gray autumn light. Behind him come the priests, dozens of them, carrying icons blackened by smoke, singing hymns of thanksgiving in voices hoarse from 2 months of prayer. Behind the priests come the soldiers, thousands of them, exhausted, bloodied, hollow-eyed, moving through the gates of a city that existed yesterday and does not exist today. The streets are unrecognizable. Where buildings stood, rubble remains. Where markets hummed with the trade of furs and silks and grain, ash settles and drifts against collapsed walls. The timber palisades that held for centuries are splintered stumps. The towers are craters. Bodies lie in every direction, on the streets, beneath fallen beams, draped across barricades that held for minutes and then held no more. Tatar warriors, Russian soldiers, civilians who were in the wrong cellar at the wrong hour. The dead do not sort themselves by allegiance. They simply lie where they fell and the living walk around them. The stench is the kind that changes a man. Burning timber, burning flesh, the iron tang of blood pooling in gutters that were not designed to carry this much of it. Smoke still rises from districts where the fires have not fully died. The air itself feels wounded. Ivan walks through all of it. His face reveals nothing. He makes his way to the central mosque, the spiritual heart of the Khanate, the place where imams called the faithful to prayer, where khans were crowned, where the name of God was spoken in Arabic across centuries of worship. He stops before it. He gives an order. A wooden Orthodox cross is raised on the spot, driven into the earth still warm from the fires. The priests chant. Icons are lifted. The Tsar kneels. He prays. He dedicates this conquest to the Virgin Mary. He thanks God for the victory. He crosses himself with hands that sign the order for the massacre that ended only hours ago. The contradiction does not trouble him. Not yet. He orders the mosque torn down. A cathedral will rise in its place. Orthodox bells will ring where the call to prayer once sounded. Russian words will fill the air where Tatar voices carried for generations. The transformation begins immediately. The Khanate's treasury is seized. Gold, silver, jewels, silks. Everything of value is loaded onto wagons and prepared for the journey back to Moscow. 3 centuries of accumulated wealth, the profits of trade, of tribute, of the slave markets that fed Kazan's prosperity, now belongs to the Tsar. Khan Yadegar is placed in chains. He will be marched to Moscow, paraded, displayed. Eventually he will accept baptism, whether by conviction or by the simple understanding that refusal means death. He will live out his remaining years as a minor noble in the Tsar's court, a quiet man in borrowed Russian clothes, attending Orthodox services, answering to a Christian name, a breathing monument to what happens to those who say no to Moscow. The Tatar population, those who survived the assault and the massacre, is expelled from the ruins, driven out through the gates they once defended. Russian colonists will replace them. Settlers from the west, brought in to fill the empty houses that still stand, to rebuild the ones that do not, to plant Russian roots in Tatar soil. Kazan will be remade. The language will change. The faith will change. The names on the streets will change. Within a generation, The city that was the last seat of Mongol power on the Volga will become as Russian as Moscow itself. The erasure is total. But the consequences, the effects that radiate outward from this smoking ruin, are larger than one city. Larger than one Khanate. Larger than anything Ivan himself fully understands on this October morning. Within 2 years, Astrakhan falls. The last remaining Tatar Khanate on the Volga, already weakened, already isolated, collapses under Russian pressure without the prolonged siege that Kazan required. Its Khan flees. Its walls are occupied. Its population is absorbed. The entire length of the Volga, from the northern forest to the Caspian Sea, now belongs to Moscow. Think about what that means. The Volga is not just a river. It is the spine of Eurasian commerce. The highway connecting the Baltic world to Persia, to Central Asia, to the Orient. Whoever controls it controls the flow of goods, of wealth, of power across the largest landmass on earth. For centuries, Tatar Khanates held that control. They taxed the trade. They profited from it. They used it to fund armies and courts and the slave markets that consumed Russian lives by the thousands. Now Russia holds it all. Russian merchants trade directly with Persia. Russian ships move goods from the northern forests to the Caspian without paying tribute to anyone. Russian military power can project eastward, deep into Central Asia, across the Urals into territories no Russian army has ever reached, without worrying about a hostile Khanate sitting on the supply lines behind them. The door to Siberia swings open. Within decades, Cossack adventurers and Russian explorers cross the Urals. They push into the vast forests beyond. They encounter the Khanate of Sibir, another Mongol successor state, and they crush it. They keep moving. Always east. Through taiga and tundra and frozen rivers that stretch for thousands of miles. The expansion does not stop. It will not stop until Russian boots stand on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. The foundation of the largest nation on Earth, a country spanning 11 time zones, 2 continents, a sixth of the world's land surface, is poured in the blood and rubble of Kazan. That is the cause and the effect. 3 centuries of subjugation, 1 siege, and an empire that will never stop growing. But victory has a cost that does not appear on any ledger, and Ivan pays it in full. Kazan teaches the young Tsar a lesson that sinks into his marrow and never leaves. Overwhelming force, applied without hesitation, without mercy, without the weakness of negotiation, can destroy threats that have endured for centuries. Total war works. Annihilation works. Terror works. He internalizes the lesson completely. In the years that follow, the patterns established at Kazan repeat themselves across Ivan's reign. The Oprichnina, his personal force of enforcers, dressed in black, riding black horses, answering to no one but the Tsar, terrorizes the Russian nobility. Boyars who displease him are executed. Their families are destroyed. Their estates are seized. The same logic that raised Kazan is now turned inward, against Ivan's own people. In 1570 he marches on Novgorod, a Russian city, and sacks it with a brutality that rivals anything inflicted on the Tatars. Thousands die. The archbishop is humiliated and deposed. The city's wealth is stripped. The message is the same one delivered at Kazan. Defy me and cease to exist. And in 1581, nearly 30 years after he knelt in prayer amid Kazan's smoking ruins, Ivan strikes his own son, his heir, Ivan Ivanovich, struck in a fit of rage with the iron-pointed staff he carries everywhere. The blow is fatal. The Tsarevich dies in his father's arms. The hands that planted the cross in Kazan's central mosque. The hands that signed the order for the assault. The hands that received the surrender of a conquered Khan. Those same hands kill the future of the dynasty he spent his life building. The man who entered Kazan in triumph at 22 dies decades later. Alone, feared by every soul in his kingdom, loved by none. His body is ravaged. His mind is consumed by the suspicion that was planted in a boyar childhood and fertilized by every victory that proved force was the only language the world understood. He builds an empire, and the empire devours him. In Moscow, when word first reached the capital that Kazan had fallen, the church bells rang for hours. Crowds gathered in the squares. People wept, not with grief but with a relief so deep it bordered on collapse. 300 years. The shadow of the Mongol yoke. The fear that had lived in Russian bones for longer than any living person could remember. Lifting. Finally lifting. Ivan orders a cathedral built in Red Square to commemorate the victory. The cathedral of the intercession of the most holy Theotokos on the moat. The world knows it by another name. St. Basil's Cathedral. Its domes, those wild, colorful onion shapes, each one different, each one said to represent a captured fortress of the Kazan campaign, rise above Red Square like a fevered dream made solid. It stands there still. Bright. Impossible. Beautiful in a way that almost makes you forget what it commemorates. Almost makes you forget the 40,000 souls. The burning streets. The bodies in the rubble. The blood on the ramparts. Almost. On October 4, 1552, as the last embers of resistance die inside the ruined city, Ivan stands on what remains of the western wall. Behind him, his banners crack in the cold autumn wind. Before him, the Volga flows as it always has. Patient. Indifferent. Carrying the ash of a fallen civilization toward the Caspian and the open sea. He has won. The Khanate is erased. 3 centuries of subjugation, answered. The gateway to the east, open. The empire, born. And the young Tsar understands, with a clarity that is both his greatest weapon and his deepest curse, that the world does not bend to righteousness. It does not yield to reason. It does not reward mercy. It yields to force. To will. To the willingness to do what others cannot stomach. Behind him, a priest approaches, carrying an icon darkened by 2 months of smoke. The Tsar kneels in the rubble, crosses himself. Around him, 150,000 men stand in silence. The battle is over. The walls have fallen. The Khanate is gone. But the echo of what happened here, the cause that built this army, the siege that broke these walls, the cost that followed the conqueror home, carries forward through centuries. It shapes the destiny of nations not yet born. It reverberates through corridors of power that do not yet exist. It lives in the colored domes of a cathedral that tourists photograph without knowing what it represents. The Siege of Kazan lasted 2 months. The final assault lasted less than a day. The consequences have lasted 5 centuries. And they have not finished yet. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of those 300 years pressing down on that fortress, if you heard the thunder of those mines splitting the earth, if you understood what was lost and what was gained in those burning streets, then share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Dark History Exhumed. We go where the textbooks refuse to look. We tell the stories that power would rather stay buried. This was Dark History Untold, where the truth stays buried until now.